Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back and let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone great. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun.
Hell yeah. Welcome back, guys.
Hey,
Good morning.
I missed you guys, Joe. Good morning.
Hey-o.
You missed me too.
You missed me too.
I did miss you. I did.
Damn right you did.
So I just wanted to say that workout you got for me, Reed, kicking my butt.
That one took an hour to complete that. Yeah, I was sitting
It
there.
takes
really...
you say it's an hour workout. I'm in there for like an hour and a half plus.
Okay.
But that's all right.
Yeah.
You not using those rest times that he's got?
30 seconds?
It's you know when
Before sets,
you say 30 seconds. I might be pushing a little over 30, probably closer to.
Get that heart
I know
It's tough.
I know. I'm just like sore. I'm sore, which is impressive.
So for the listeners that don't know, we've got something fun coming to you pretty soon in the near future, and it is workout templates. They're going to be customized workout templates that you're able to kind of shape to your goals, your activity level, and all that. And Reed's got Joe starting his, and sounds like it's working pretty darn good.
Yeah, it is. I think it is. We'll see. We got to get some before and after pictures. We should do that.
Oh, a little photo shoot.
Yeah, a little photo shoot.
Yeah. Joe stripped down to his skinnies, snap some pics.
Birthday shoot.
We should have you do one of those like model struts and walk down
Naked?
back. Around.
Naked. And on top of the workout, Luke's putting together a little diet plan for me.
Yeah, so we're going to have nutritional templates too for different goals, whether it be build muscle, lose weight, lose body fat, and you know how to follow specific caloric intake, protein targets, and all that.
And I'm going to track my progress through all this so you can follow along my journey and join in if you want. Yeah, I think that's going to be fun.
You're our little lab rat.
I am. I am.
We gotta show that it works before we send it off to the public.
Yeah, you give me feeding times. You just come over and you're like, all right, here you go.
Put a little running wheel in his bedroom.
Yeah. Oh, jeez.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Kickback Science. Today, we're going to be talking about all things cold exposure.
Yes.
So, Dr. Luke, let's kind of just get started on what cold exposure is.
Well, cold exposure, I think, is like the new trend. Like, if you don't do it, then you're not tough. You're not cool.
Yeah.
Literally, everyone seems to do it. And it's one of those things where if you don't film yourself doing it, were you really doing it?
Dude, that's so true. You
Right?
see that.
Like,
every video is like,
yeah.
he has to film. It's like, all right,
Yeah.
just sit there like...
Yeah, people will just get in the cold water. And what's funny is they'll hold as steady as they can and try to like show, you know, I'm so adapted and calm and tough. And there's actually something to this. When you get into cold water, and you're going to notice you get this like gasp reflex where it takes your breath away initially.
Isn't it called like the diver's, what is it called?
Well, the mammalian dive reflex.
Yeah,
I see
yeah.
you're getting at. So that's actually after you're in the water for a period of time. We'll talk about the physiology of that, but there are these reflexes of like cold shock.
Yeah.
And so people will get into the water, and over time, you'll get adapted to this level of cold. And so you won't get that cold shock quite as much. And so these people will like hop into these cold tubs and just be like, look how calm I am. I'm so tough. But it's funny because they're actually not getting as much benefit when they're holding steady like that, because your body temperature actually creates this thermic layer around you. And you can actually feel this next time you're in a pool that's colder than really, I mean, any pool this is going to work for. But when you get in any water that's colder than body temperature and you hold really steady for a while, and then slowly move, you'll notice all of a sudden the water feels colder as you start to move your limbs. And it's because you get this thermic layer where the water that's right around your
I
body.
have noticed that before.
Yeah, the water that's right around your body is actually warmer when it's in contact with your skin. And so next time you see someone pretending to be all tough because they hold steady, you should comment and be like, actually, you're not that tough. If you just slowly moved your limbs, then you'd be tough. And so, yeah.
If you're in the shower, if you feel the water bouncing off your skin, that's also a different temperature. You ever notice that? So
like just hitting your skin and then heating up.
No, it is. I swear to God.
I'm gonna have to try that out.
I swear it is. Maybe I'm just like crazy, but whatever.
I don't know. I've never like checked like, oh, I wonder what the water temperature is that's bouncing off my skin. So, but the now I lost my train of thought.
Good. I did too.
Yeah.
Oh, well, so like on this like holding steady, I just wanted to mention too, like if you are trying to get the greatest benefit out of cold water and make sure that you keep getting this stress, moving just slightly is going to be the best way to do that, because then you don't allow this thermic layer to develop around your skin. And you don't want to move super fast and shiver, because shivering actually produces heat on its own. When you start shivering, your body's actually contracting your muscles to generate heat. That's a method of heating yourself up. So you don't want to like do that in the cold water. Sorry for the shaking sound. For the people who are not watching video of this, I am shivering. You don't want to do that, but just moving slightly in the cold. And so we just dove into the science right away. But I mean, it's funny how much this has blown up. It seems.
Oh yeah,
everyone.
Like you see Joe Rogan. You got Kevin Hart.
Oh yeah, the coldest balls.
Coldest balls.
I love that. That's
like
awesome.
Everybody's doing. Like I see on my Instagram reels, it's just people sitting in cold tubs. Or like my buddy's mom. She actually, in the metro area, she would go in the lake in the wintertime and just with a group of people, and they just go all just standing there in the lake.
And this isn't like a polar plunge. This is them just like going
every morning. They're just going and doing this. Yeah.
No,
they actually had an article about it in the paper. It was crazy.
Have you guys done cold water immersion, like whether it be like cold tubs or shower or anything?
You know, when we had talked about cold water a while ago, you mentioned to try it out, and I didn't.
You didn't?
No, one of my old coworkers,
I take that back. I did try it, but man, I hate cold water.
It's tough.
Yeah, well, that's the reason that it actually has a lot of benefits, is because of how uncomfortable it is. Yeah. See, we live in this like society where it's easy for us to fall into the path of least resistance. You know, you don't have to do anything uncomfortable in your life if you don't want to. You can sit at home and get one of those incliner beds that just reclines up so that you can eat and drink from your own bed. Never leave the house. You can order DoorDash, your groceries. You can order like groceries and a stuffed bald eagle to your front door. You know, there's literally no limits to what you can get delivered to you. So you never have to have any discomfort. And as humans, naturally, it's easy for us to follow this path of least resistance. So something that creates such a high level of stress, like cold water immersion, it's hard to get people to do that.
When I've done it, I've had to like really slowly turn it down, and then
you slowly adapt.
Yeah, and then I get to that point where the breath gets taken away, and I'm like, "Yeah, no, I'm good."
Yeah, you kind of start gasping. You're like,
"Yeah."
I do it for like a couple seconds. I'm like, "All right, that was good."
30, yeah,
but I'm probably not getting any benefits from it.
Well, what's interesting with the research is there's such a range of temperatures that are studied. I mean, some of these, the water can be as low as freezing, and then some it's a lot warmer. And so there's not really this like temperature range or this specific temperature. It's quite a range here.
Yeah, because don't you just you want to start higher, really, because your body needs to
adapt to it.
Otherwise, you're just putting your body in shock, which I know I get that's part of it. But if you go into too much shock, like, couldn't some shit happen?
I mean, you're not gonna have any detrimental effects from just the initial shock itself. It's when you stay in that cold water for longer periods of time. And we'll dive into that here in a second, no pun intended. But yeah, so like this temperature range in the research, you often see from 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is from 5 to 15 degrees Celsius in that range. That's what's most often studied. That's a pretty wide range. And 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius, I mean, that's cold and not comfortable, but it's not freezing. So you don't have to get into like your friend's mom with like that water is right at freezing, you know? You don't have to. And if you do, you have to change the time you're in the cold water there. So if you're in a higher temperature, you need to. All right, video went out here, so I had to get the video going. So back to the temperature here. There's quite a wide range, you know, and you don't have to get into freezing cold water. If you do get into freezing cold water, then you don't have to stay in there quite as long. And so if you're in the warmer water, you got to increase the temperature. And it all comes down to this like stress-induced stimulus. And we're going to talk about this a lot in this podcast because we're going to talk about exercise a lot and other protocols that when you initiate this process referred to as hormesis, where you have these acute stressors, in acute meaning these temporary short-term stressors for your body. When you have these over time, your body starts to adapt to these stressors. And so it's important to stress your body out more to get these adaptations. And so this, you need to stay in the water for a certain amount of time to make it a stressful experience, or like to force your body into this stress response. If you hop into 60 degree water and then you keep doing, 5 minutes for months at a time, that water you're going to become adapted to, which is a good thing. Your body is adapting to this stress. And so you actually have to either increase the time, decrease the temperature. It's the same thing with exercise. Over time, you have to increase, let's say resistance training, weight sets or repetitions. Volume has to go up somehow. If you don't, you're going to be fully adapted to that, and you're no longer going to get these benefits that stressor will provide. And so progression in cold water, it goes down the same path as progression in exercise. You kind of follow these same concepts. And before we dive so much into the protocols and stuff, let's talk about like why the hell are people getting in cold water in the first place? Like, where did this start?
Where did it start? Because all of a sudden, like you were saying, Joe Rogan, Kevin Hart, like that shit started popping up, and then it was, honestly, it's everywhere.
Oh yeah,
people are buying those. They got little tubs, little like packages on Amazon you can buy for a cold tub. They're just everywhere.
Yeah. Industry is booming.
Yeah, like a trainer back in like 2015-16 that I worked with, he used to take cold showers every morning, and we all thought he was crazy, but like now it's really like caught on.
At least that I've noticed. Started selling the tubs.
I know. It's like, whoa, I should have started tub selling right there. But yeah, like what's the craze behind it? Why are people doing it?
So what's interesting about cold water is there, people have been doing this a lot.
Like the polar plunge.
Well, the polar plunge was...
Sorry, you're probably not going there, but I did.
yeah. The polar plunge is more of like one of those like charitable events.
Yeah, but it is the same thing.
Yeah. Doing a polar plunge, the benefits you're going to see. But where you have seen cold water a lot is with athletes. So this high intensity activity where after any sort of game practice, a lot of athletes that are doing high volume work are hopping in the cold tub afterwards. That's been happening for quite some time. And it's because of this group of studies that have shown that cold water immersion reduces this delayed onset muscle soreness, or what is referred to as DOMS. Anyone who is involved in resistance training is familiar with that soreness effect one day and then 2 days after your workout. Joe's going through that right now.
I was just gonna say,
You should
I'll
hop
get
in
the
Go
tub
do
ready.
that right now,
Yeah, you could hop in
100%.
some cold. Well, we'll talk about why
But-
you might not want to later.
Yeah.
The like, so athletes hop in because, you know, you think about a sport like, let's say hockey, for example. You're going such high intensity for hours at a time, and then you've got practice the next day, you've got a game 2 days later, and you've got to try to perform at this high level again. That's going to take a toll on your body. And if you feel sore, you're not going to perform at that optimum of a level. And so there is a group of studies that has demonstrated that there is some significance here. When you get into cold water, there is a reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness. And this is actually true in terms of muscle damage itself. And so it preserves this damage of the muscle. And there's a reduction in inflammation in a variety of studies, but this is actually interesting because some papers show that there's no effect on inflammatory markers. And when we throw around this inflammation word, again, you want to ask people when they say inflammation, like, what aspect of inflammation are you referring to? Because inflammation is beneficial. When you exercise, you get a rise in inflammatory markers. You don't want to, avoid that. But in terms of recovery, reducing inflammation is going to result in a reduction in feeling of soreness. And so you can look at these inflammatory cytokines, which we talked about in another podcast episode, where these cytokines are these markers that are released to recruit different immune cells and to start this process of recovery and repair of the muscle. Those cytokines actually trigger these sensory neurons, or these nerves that result in the feeling of pain and discomfort and such. And so if you have a decrease in these cytokines, your muscles aren't going to be quite as sore. So there are plenty of papers that show this reduction in inflammation. Now, again, that area is kind of all over the place, and some showing no change. So the reason we see a reduction in delayed onset muscle soreness actually might not be due to this reduction in inflammation, but either way, it's happening. People get into cold water after this level of exertion, and they see that their feeling of soreness, so perceived soreness, how they actually feel, is improved, so they don't feel as sore. And then they look at muscle damage, and the muscle is not quite as damaged if they do this. Now, this is only true in these, according to where we're at with the research right now. There's a recent meta-analysis that came out in 2022 that took 52 different studies. This was done down in Australia,
mate.
Adelaide, actually. Shout out Ben Teakle. And they looked at 52 different papers with people who exercised and did cold water after they exercised for 15 minutes. The temperature ranges were from 40 to all the way up to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And the temperature or the time wasn't always 15 minutes. That ranged too from 10 to 15 with, if you're at a warmer temperature, you're in there for longer. But what they found is that it depended on the type of activity in terms of the benefits you get in delayed onset muscle soreness. That there was a improvement in high intensity exercise, especially. And so high intensity, and then also endurance
When
training.
you say high intensity, are you talking like sprints, long distance running, CrossFit, lifting heavy weights?
So that's a good question. So the high intensity exercise included a variety of things, but really it was making sure that the participants or athletes were going to failure, some level of fatigue. So as opposed to, just like a moderate walk, jog type
Like
thing.
sprint
that doesn't
or sprint until you're
sprints,
lying
or
on the
even
ground.
or even resistance training, multiple sets
till
of
you-
multiple reps to
okay.
failure. That's high intensity.
Until you can't lift the weight, basically.
Right. And so this delayed onset muscle soreness seems to apply to, these high intensity athletes. And this is also true for endurance training. So it helps the feeling of recovery here. What's interesting, though, is there's another meta-analysis that came out before this 2022 paper from Australia. This one was the year before, and they looked at a variety of randomized controlled trials. These are highly controlled studies that tend to give us a little bit more of an insight on causative factors of the intervention being measured, as opposed to these cohort studies they're referred to, where we observe populations and just see, do they get diseases over time when we're assessing different interventions. So randomized controlled studies are much more highly controlled, and they tend to be a little bit more interesting in terms of the findings. So in this paper, they looked at a group of randomized controlled trials for cold water immersion, and then also for sauna use, so heat exposure. It wasn't just saunas. It was, some of it was like heating pads versus non-heating pads. So they looked at ice versus heat, or cold versus hot. And they found, and they were just looking at DOMS. We're still just talking about delayed onset muscle soreness here. And they found that both heat and cold reduced delayed onset muscle soreness 24 hours after the workout, but only heat was able to sustain that feeling of, perceived muscle soreness and also muscle damage. So actually heat is more superior in terms of this delayed onset muscle soreness that you're going to get. This is something that people don't really talk a ton about, is like everyone's just hyping up the cold water because it's trendy right now and you can record a cool video yourself being tough. But people fail to bring up that heat is probably a little bit better at this, And so I want to bring that up because we talk about sauna and all these impacts it has. And we're going to move through.
You say probably at 100%. No, I shouldn't say 100%. It's 99% better.
Well, in terms of recovery based on this group of studies, it points to heat being superior to cold. But, in a research world and something that's hard to study, it's hard to make these conclusions because you think about cold water and heat. It's really hard to have a control group. It's hard to convince someone that they're in cold water when they're not, because you want to compare cold water versus the not cold water. You can do that as a control, but it helps when you have like a placebo type trial where you can have people not know which group they're in. You can't really blind these studies. If you're cold or you're not cold, and so it just makes them a little less controlled. So the data tend to be a little bit more variable there. But still, you do see these trends when you're looking at these systematic reviews and meta-analyses that group all the research together. They can point to these more causative factors of what we're assessing. And so that's what we're seeing right now is heat seems to be superior if you're looking at trying to feel better 48 hours or longer than 24 hours after. If you're doing a heavy workout and you want to feel better just tomorrow, seems to not matter. You can do cold or heat, but if you're trying to prolong that, heat seems to be superior.
Does cold water have any cardiovascular benefits like the sauna does?
What's interesting, so that stuff hasn't been studied. There are some papers showing a reduction in blood pressure with certain populations. Like there's a huge study that came out of Denmark where they looked at people who were swimming in cold water, and that was just their way of training. And those people had a reduction in blood pressure. Now the problem is, and we're going to talk about this study because probably like if you listen to the Huberman podcast, and he brings this up as being like this pillar of cold water research, this groundbreaking study, but I don't agree at all with that statement. So we'll dive into how that relates to other aspects. But when you're looking at a population that's exercising, we know exercise has these cardiovascular benefits. You can't sit here and tell me that it's the cold that's doing that. I'm not going to buy it. But there are papers suggesting a reduction in blood pressure. We do not have the data suggesting these improved cardiovascular risk factors like we do with sauna, though. So it doesn't seem to be that there's this cardiovascular benefit. However, think about it in terms of like what's actually happening when you get in cold water. This cold shock response resembles on some level of similarity what we see with sauna and then also what we see with exercise. So if you listen to the sauna podcast, you heard me relate the physiological outcomes that happen while you're in the sauna to what's happening in exercise. Now, a similar set of effects is happening when you get into the cold. You hop into the cold, you're going to start increasing your respiratory rate. This happens right away. And then, Joe, you brought up this mammalian dive reflex that we'll talk about in a second. But right away, you're going to increase respiratory rate. Blood pressure is going to go up. So your blood vessels constrict because they're trying to maintain heat. So you've got these nerve receptors that on your skin sense, holy shit, it is freezing and we need to make sure that we don't get rid of any heat. We don't want any blood going to the skin. We don't want to be sweating. We want to save that heat. So it redirects all that blood flow to your core. Your core has all these vital organs that need to maintain a certain temperature. We don't really care about our fingertips at this moment here. And so all the blood flow is getting redirected there. Now that constriction in blood flow and the increase in respiratory rate, along with an increase in heart rate, these things increase blood pressure. And all these acute stressors, again, acute being the short-term stress, your body, again, is going to be like, whoa, what the heck just happened? And how can I make it so next time I have this level of stress, I don't freak out as much? And that's the process of adaptation to these stressors. So you see the heart becomes more efficient at pumping blood pressure drops, you're going to become adapted to temperature, you're going to thermoregulate better. And so I bring that up to form a hypothesis of maybe there is some cardiovascular benefit you're getting here. Now, I don't know though. We don't know the answer to that question. Could be that it actually provides some level of risk. We just don't know the answer to that question. What we do know is that sauna does that, though.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see a study like that sees if you have that cardiovascular increase. But yeah, because there's a lot of studies on sauna, but that'd be cool if they did a study on that as well.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see it.
Let's talk about other forms of cold immersion, cryotherapy. You'll see it like Antonio Brown did it, but he also lost like a toe, I think. But
poor AB.
What are the benefits of that compared to
Do you think that was
taking
the
a cold
start
shower?
of him going nuts?
Maybe cryo turns you into Antonio Brown.
Yeah. You'll see it in those like therapy clinics pushing that, but I don't know if there's a big craze compared to like the cold plunge or like in the cold tubs or cold showers.
This is kind of quieted down in my opinion. I
only heard about it one time, like a few years ago. I had a buddy doing it. He's like, it's the best thing ever. You just walk into this freezing cold room and you just stand in there for a while and then get out and you feel like a brand new baby.
Brand new baby.
Well, I mean, that's essentially it. You're trying to feel like a brand new baby. So people were latching onto this trend, and then these cryo chambers is what they are. They essentially are pumping this freezing cold liquid nitrogen gas into these chambers. And so it's actually like way, way colder in terms of temperature. It's from like negative 160 to 260 degrees Fahrenheit, this liquid nitrogen gas getting pumped into the chambers. But what's interesting is that subjectively, meaning the perception of the person going into different cold, subjectively, people feel more uncomfortable in cold water versus cryo. Now, I haven't actually done cryo. I had the opportunity to do it and I totally turned it down because I just like wasn't feeling like going in. I kind of wish I would have because now I'm kind of curious the difference.
You do it when you're in Minnesota.
Yeah, basically hop outside. It's basically negative 160 out right now.
Yeah. And we walk out when you take your dog out in shorts and a t-shirt. So,
Yeah. But so you're in this freezing cold liquid nitrogen chamber essentially, but the gas versus liquid in terms of temperature, gas isn't able to extract heat from your body as effectively. And so it doesn't feel as cold. But the typical protocols are about 3 minutes. You hop into these chambers, and a lot of like wellness centers were really pushing these like, oh, come hop in because of all these effects we see. And there are some comparative studies looking at cryo versus cold water. And seems to be, based on a majority of the data, that cold water is far superior than cryo in terms of the benefits you're getting. So I wouldn't say anyone should waste their money on going to a facility that has a cryo chamber when you could go get a bag of ice and pour it in your bathtub and fill it up with cold water, or just as cold as you're setting on your bathtub, or even a shower, which we'll talk about here in a minute. That's all free minus the water payments, but you don't have to spend the money on cryo. And so like one paper, for example, looked at recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage and cold water versus whole body cryo. And they did single leg eccentric exercise. So it was 5 sets of 15 reps to fatigue. And
Eccentric, can you just explain?
Yeah. Good question. So when you contract muscle, there's different ways or different types of muscle contraction. You have shortening of the muscle, which is what you often think of in terms of contracting. That's called concentric, the shortening phase. And then you have lengthening of the muscle. So if you've ever seen people go slow on like the down phase of a lift, that is them focusing on this eccentric phase of the movement, or the lengthening of the muscle, which has been shown to induce more muscle damage. So people that are really into hypertrophy-based exercise, growing muscle size, will focus a lot on heavyweight, eccentric, or lengthening muscle movements, and really try to harvest that effect of potentially having more muscle damage. So when I say eccentric here, I'm talking about like inducing muscle damage in a lengthening phase of the repetition. And then isometric is just contracting your muscle, but not moving the joint itself. So what they did is they had them do these different strength or eccentric exercises, and then hopped in either cold water for 10 minutes or cryo after the session. And then they did a variety of tests afterwards. One of those being a counter movement jump, assessing like power. And they found that cold water was superior than cryo in terms of counter movement. And then they also found it was superior in terms of muscle damage that was experienced as well from the eccentric exercise. So cold water seems to be better. And then there's also this interesting paper. This was done in 2018 with a group of marathon runners. And these people this was in London, where they essentially had them go run a marathon, and they checked all these baseline metrics of inflammation and muscle damage and all this before they ran the marathon. And then they did it again right after, and then at 24 hours and 48 hours. They also tested things like strength and other assessments after the marathon was done to see what is the impact we have on cold water versus cryo. And then they also had a placebo group, which was super cool. So they had this group of participants that they told about this juice that was shown to be anti-inflammatory. And they're like, oh yeah, we're studying the anti-inflammatory effects of this juice, so drink it 5 days before your marathon, so that they'd have this placebo effect of like, oh, I'm going to get decreased inflammation, because you want to see, is there a placebo impact here too? But they actually just gave them a flavored water, and it had no anti-inflammatory, no antioxidants, nothing. Super cool. And so then they compared these 3 groups. You have the cold water, cryo, and then that controlled juice drinking group that was your placebo group. And they compared muscle recovery performance and inflammatory markers. And they found that cryo was actually worse than placebo.
Than the juice group?
Even the placebo.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was worse. It had a negative impact on muscle function and this feeling of soreness. And so they actually felt more sore than the placebo group. Isn't that interesting?
Don't do
I have a feeling the cryo
waste your
companies
money.
out there are going to be coming after us.
Yeah.
You're ruining our business.
Well, I keep glancing down at my data when you start talking, so then I have no idea what you guys are saying.
We'll get a cease and desist.
Yeah.
I'll hear it when I listen back to the
It's
pod.
all good.
But I don't want to say cryo has a negative impact, because there are papers that show it is superior than cold water. There is one study that just showed, these are middle and long distance runners, and they looked at after one workout what happens if you do cold water versus cryo, 2 inflammatory markers, and cryo was able to reduce inflammatory markers better than cold water, but this wasn't consistent. They measured a variety, and some were higher in cold water, so it kind of seems like I don't know, like this. What I should say,
tight of a study, basically, is what you're saying.
Well, it was a good study, but what I point all this out to say, when people act like cryo is superior to cold water, that is absolutely not the case. And, there's papers suggesting that cryo is actually worse than cold water at all these, perceived soreness, even exercise performance and inflammatory markers. But, and this comes back to this, like, when there's some causative factor of some intervention, you're going to tend to see consistent results, especially at these meta-analyses that are done. The hard part with cold water, and this is true with sauna as well. The hard part with these cohort observational studies that are done is, we've talked about that, but even the meta-analyses that are done, in order to perform a accurate meta-analysis, you want to look at making sure that the studies that are being done are among consistent populations. You want to try to control for all these variables of, are they comparing the same age group, same activity level, same population in terms of all these other aspects.
Does diet have anything?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. And so in meta-analyses, they're able to do this really, really well. But if you don't have a lot of consistent studies, then you don't have a lot of data to choose from, so there's just not a lot of research on certain things, this being one of them, the cold water versus cryo. But it does seem that there's a pretty clear group of research suggesting cryo is absolutely not more beneficial than cold water. And so, Reed, you asked about the different modalities of cold water. Yeah. There's also just shower in general, and even just like being outside.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't have access to a cold tub. Those are pretty expensive. So, like, most people have access to showers. So, what's the protocol there?
Just take their old freezer and fill it up with water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That works too. You got to waterproof it, though. I've watched
freezer?
Videos.
Oh, you do?
I thought about doing it myself. Yeah.
You see people, like, coming in with sledgehammer in the morning, breaking the ice. You can use a shower. And there is a paper that looked at just cold showers and saw, do you have the same like physiological adaptations that you do with cold water immersion? And they tested a couple different protocols with a couple different shower temperatures and found that the coldest was at 10 degrees, which is 50 degrees, or 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which actually happens to be like the coldest you're going to get your shower anyways. So they went to this temperature for that reason.
So that's full blast.
Yeah, that's like absolutely as cold as you can get it. Most households are going to be right around that 50. Some can't even get, like, you go to these hotter climate areas in the summer.
Freezing water when I'm doing it.
Way colder.
Yeah, Minnesota, we for sure get down to that 50 degree or 10 degrees Celsius.
Like it's freezing.
Whereas like you go to like Florida or Texas or something, and like in the summer, it's harder to get the water temperature that cold. But anyway, they compared the essentially it was like 50 to 60 degrees or 10 to 15 degrees Celsius water temperatures, and 50 degrees seemed to have more significant benefits here, but it did result in a similar level of adaptations. Now, what's important to note when you're doing a shower protocol, you don't have to put your head under the shower at all. And think about it, when you do cold water immersion, I mean, how many people on the videos do you see just like holding themselves underwater? These are all head out immersions that are being studied. Yeah, like people will like go underwater and come right back up. But the benefits you're getting, you don't have to put your head under at all. And so when you're in the shower, what you want to do is the one area that will cause this reflex is your torso, upper chest area. That's going to, like, you notice that when you get into like a cold lake and you're walking in the shore, at some point, all of a sudden you get that. Well, it's that's a different reflex there of like, feeling the little boys getting a little cold. Yeah. But you get that gasp reflex as you start getting more towards your diaphragm, your chest. And so that's the area that you want to make sure gets through. Yeah, exactly. You're keeping like your arms out of water. So you can do that in the shower. And what you want to do is just make sure the water's hitting your chest for a period of time, and then flip around, make it hit your back, and then keep doing that and switching. And you can treat the protocol the same. Try 3 minutes on the chest, switch, do 3 minutes on the back, and then end with like 30 seconds on each side or so.
Gary Brecka was saying your best buddy. Gary Brecka was saying like 2 to 6
Classic
minutes
Gary.
is kind of where that sweet spot where you want to go.
Yeah.
Where you see benefits at 2 minutes, but like don't exceed 6.
I feel like exceeding isn't going to matter because you're adapting.
The problem with Gary Brecka is a lot of things, but the problem with the 2 to 6 minute thing is like you're going to adapt to that, and you're going to actually need to go above that 6 minutes.
Okay.
Think about it as what we were talking about before, where it's going to not induce this stress response if you keep stopping at the same amount of time. At some point, you're going to have to, if you want to continue to see these adaptations, you're going to have to get out of the shower and hop in an ice bath, because the shower can only get so cold, and you don't want to sit in there for an hour.
Yeah.
Maybe.
It
I mean,
wastes
go
way too
ahead.
much
But
water,
yeah, the 2 to 6 range is just a made up number. Classic Gary.
Classic
but
Gary.
you, I wouldn't stop at 2, or stop at 6. Now, for the 2 minute thing, it's totally going to be different. Hop in the shower and make sure you induce that gasp reflex where it takes your breath away. You're going to feel that. And then try to stay in there till where you can feel this level of, and this is where, we'll talk about the mammalian dive reflex, where you get in this cold shock response, and then your body actually tries to like preserve oxygen. And they call it the dive reflex, similar to when people are like diving underwater in diving in cold water. And your respiratory rate is going to go down. It kind of resembles like holding your breath in a way. Your blood pressure is going to drop. Your heart rate drops. Your parasympathetic nervous system gets really in control. And that's your like rest and digest, calm yourself down part of your nervous system. There's a lot of theories suggesting that that's actually what happens after a period of time in cold. And Joe, when you do this, you'll notice, Reed, you've probably noticed this. So, and this is what I shoot for getting in the cold, and it happens a lot earlier, but you get in the cold, you get this cold shock. And then after, for me, it's right around like 30 seconds, I can actually get pretty comfortable. And it's not like,
you get acclimated.
Yeah. And then you actually start to calm yourself down. And so that initial cold shock is what you have to kind of push through. And that's the hardest part. So if you're getting into like a cold water immersion protocol, just try getting to that point where you can actually sustain it, because once you get past that point, I mean, you can stay in there for quite a while, but you don't want to stay in there too long. And if the water is really cold, so when you get into like the approaching freezing temperatures, that water can reduce your body temperature pretty significantly if you stay in there for a long period of time. I mean, I wouldn't recommend anyone go in these freezing cold tubs for longer than a few minutes. I mean, definitely not longer. Yeah. So you can get hypothermia, where your body temperature, when it drops, induces these ectopic heart conditions, which are essentially like these improper conduction in the heart that causes these irregular heartbeats that can actually kill you. And so you definitely do not want to stay in there to that point. And so if you're doing much colder water,
let's say you've adapted, you've slowly worked your way down to that freezing temperature. Are you more adapted at that point, or does it really matter with it being freezing?
You will never be able to sit in that water and not have it have an impact on your body temperature. I mean, like some of the studies, like one study, when we talk about like the mental health side of things, they used an hour. They had cold water, but their participants sit in cold water for an hour, but that water was 57 degrees, just short of 15 degrees Celsius. And so you can sit in there for an hour, but you're definitely not sitting in 32 to 40 some degrees at that time. So yeah, you definitely don't want to induce hypothermia. I wouldn't recommend people try to push past
Yeah,
this
definitely
point
not. Yeah.
when you're in cold water.
So, can I touch on athletes again real quick?
Yeah.
So, with them doing the cold water to reduce their soreness, what about with people who work out and bodybuilders and trying to gain muscle and then they hit that cold water?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing because, like, I'm doing a really high protein diet. I'm trying to build muscle. Like, is this something that'll be beneficial for me to gain muscle, or does it have a decrease?
This is the part, hey, for all you people listening that just absolutely love cold water, plug your ears for this, okay? Because this is
going
where
to be controversial?
no, this is not. It's not controversial because the research.
I think it
clear.
is controversial.
No, it's just like people have this thought of like cold water is going to cure cancer and it's going to solve all the world's problems. Just everyone hop in a cold tub. So this is the area that people get a little bit like, wait, what? No, cold water only has benefits, no risk. But there's a
They
group
sound
of
just like that.
yeah. There's a group of papers showing this clear negative impact cold water has on muscle hypertrophy, so muscle growth, even strength adaptations, and then also protein synthesis. So when I say muscle growth, when your muscles need to grow, they'll go through protein synthesis, which if you haven't yet, listen to the protein episode where we break down really all the mechanisms of how that's happening. But essentially, your muscles need to take up amino acids from the blood and then use them to build back stronger and build back larger. And cold water, when done in combination with any strength training, resistance training that's aimed at improving strength and muscle size, has a negative impact on this.
Wow.
And
I say that.
So that's not for me then.
I say that's controversial.
so we brought up this 2021 meta-analysis when we were talking about people who were exercising and doing cold afterwards and how it improved delayed onset muscle soreness. Well, what they also found is, in this group of research, things like 1 rep max were decreasing. So people's strength adaptations were declining. And this is pretty well represented in a couple different studies. One of them being on protein synthesis and what happens to your muscles' protein synthesis after you exercise if you go in the cold water. So they took a group of young male adults and they had them do a single leg resistance training exercise to fatigue and did it was like a 20-minute protocol that they did on one leg, and then the other leg was not, pushing weight at all. And then they had them put the muscle or the lower body in cold water, and then they came back another time and did it with the other leg and used room temperature water. So you've got a cold water versus, this control part. And they're their own control participants. So it's the same person, and they use different legs to make sure there wasn't anything that happened with the previous resistance protocol on that one leg that impacted the other. So it's a pretty tightly controlled study. And then they had them drink this labeled protein drink that we talked a lot about in the protein podcast, how you can actually label these amino acids so you can see if they get absorbed into the bloodstream when you drink a protein shake, and then you can see where they end up. And so if you stab the muscle and take out this little chunk of the muscle in the biopsies, it's a brutal process. I had these done a few times, the muscle biopsies, and it was in my leg too, which is what happened in these participants. And I was just crying like a baby. It was actually when I was doing research down in Australia, and everyone was like laughing at me because I'm just like, oh my God. Because you go into the muscle and it literally is like an apple core process where they put this thing into the muscle that is, when they twist it, it will pull some of the muscle out, and then you use a suction component to pull it out. And I got to be on both sides. So I've done this process, and I've also had it done to me, and it's more uncomfortable for some people like me. Apparently I'm a baby, but it's painful. But anyway, so they do this, and then they can then assess how much of that protein is absorbed into the muscle itself. And they found that the cold water decreased the ability of the muscle to absorb this protein. And obviously that's going to have an impact on protein synthesis. And that was actually demonstrated in another study too, like what's actually happening within the muscle.
The cold water. I didn't think it would have any effect. That's just wild. So
I mean,
basically, if you're trying to build muscle, you don't want to do any cold.
I mean, that's what it sounded like.
Yeah.
So then another group or another paper, they assessed kind of a similar approach here where they had a group of participants that were their own control subjects, did lower body resistance training, what happens with cold water versus just an active recovery. So, stretching, just cooling down. And what does cold water do to within the muscle cell itself? And so when your muscle is damaged, that is sensed by a variety of things within the muscle. And your muscle has multiple nuclei within it. It's only multi-nucleated cell in the body, and that just showcases how important your darn muscle is. These nuclei are just kind of hanging out. The nucleus of the cell is really what has this blueprint and ability to send out all these different proteins and make all these different components of the cell to make sure it survives and can grow. And so the muscle's just got a bunch of these. They're referred to as satellite cells. And they're just kind of hanging out, waiting to see if anything's damaged. They just kind of like wake up and like, whoa, let's fix that. And that initiates this protein synthesis process, or it's involved in this protein synthesis process. And they found that cold water immersion suppressed this activation of these satellite cells. So it hindered that cell's ability to grow. And it resulted in a decline in the size of the muscle. Now, that wasn't tested in this study, but this same group of authors did a kind of a follow-up on this exact same mechanism. So they found that there were these enzymes that were suppressed in terms of activating protein synthesis, and then that satellite cell activation declined too. So the muscle's ability to do this. Now, this was just one acute bout of exercise. What happens over time, though? And they found, so what they did is they took a group of people and measured them over 12 weeks and had them either doing cold water after their resistance training sessions or active recovery. And this training protocol was aimed at improving strength and improving muscle size. And they found that the participants doing cold water immersion had a decline in strength adaptations.
Decline?
Wow.
Like
So-
they didn't even maintain?
I'm glad you just brought that up because I don't want to confuse people. No, they still improved strength. It doesn't diminish your
Okay.
ability to increase strength. They still did. It was just if they didn't do cold water, they had a much greater increase in strength.
Yeah. Okay.
And so cold water just hindered the ability to improve strength, but they still did have an increase. And it was pretty significant too. They still did see quite a bit of strength. It was just much, much, much more of an increase in that active recovery group.
So if you're trying to build muscle, just stay away from cold immersion.
Yeah, and they actually have this interesting point at the end where it's a group of data suggesting, okay, we saw a decline in muscle cross-sectional area. So they looked at the size of these muscle cells, which is what grows that causes your muscles to look larger, or to be larger, I should say. And so that was decline, protein synthesis was decline, and strength was decline. So they say, taken together, these studies suggest that individuals who use strength training to improve athletic performance, recover from an injury, or maintain their health should therefore reconsider whether to use cold water immersion as an adjuvant to their training. So if you fit amongst that group of people, which I'd argue even if you don't, I mean, why would you ever want to impact your ability to grow muscle? I mean, tune into the protein podcast where we touch on it, and I would love to talk about the importance of muscle as a whole in a whole podcast itself.
With the cold water, it's like a mental strengthening more than anything. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting from this is like it wakes you up in the morning, you're kind of pushing yourself through that stressor and in that way, but as for athletic abilities, I would say it's negatively impacting you. Is that kind of true, or is that a bad question?
I mean, no. That's a good question.
Never a bad question, Joe.
No dumb question.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily true. Now, because think about the athletes that do cold water immersion afterwards so that they can come out and perform. The cold water did not have an impact on your ability to go through this high intensity performance after, so like when you hop in a cold tub after a game, you can still perform at that level and you're not as sore. That improves
endurance, stamina.
Well, and just ability to do the high intensity exercise. Strength is diminished, but a lot of athletes, it's not, they're relying on their capacity to perform at these high intensities relative to like get your heart rate up, and be able to sustain these long games and practices at high intensities. That is not impaired. That's improved. And so it still serves a purpose here, but they don't often, during the season, you don't see athletes training for muscle growth and strength adaptations. Your training actually shifts while you're in season to really not, you're focusing more on specific movements and not working on or not inducing as much muscle damage and muscle growth. That is not your goal during season. That stuff comes off season. And then you wouldn't incorporate cold water. You wouldn't incorporate ice during that period of time. So it still plays a role in athletes.
So these studies sound like they're doing cold water immersion like right as they're doing training. Is there any studies that show like, because I take a shower in the morning, but I don't work out in the morning. Would that still decrease my muscle gains if I did in the morning? Or is it just like that short time period where your muscles are trying to rebuild? I'm
really glad you brought that up because the paper that looked at the satellite cell, delaying the satellite cell activation, that was still present after 24 hours. They still saw this attenuation in activation of protein synthesis and building. So even if you did a cold water immersion in the morning to wake yourself up and you did resistance training in the evening, it seems to be that there could still be this effect.
Oh, wow.
This prolonged impact that cold water has. So, no, I wouldn't say that you could just change the time. I mean, if you're not going to lift for a couple days, and go ahead and hop in the cold water. But if your goals are strength and hypertrophy, I'd stay out of the tub. Now, it's interesting though, because I don't want to tell people to stay out of it because of this other really cool area. I mean, Joe brought up this like wake up in the morning determination.
Best cup of coffee. I kept reading that on Reddit. Like people are like, this is the best cup of coffee I've ever had. I'm so awake, so alert.
Yeah. And that plays a huge role in people's lives. I mean, again, I don't ever want to tell someone that their goal shouldn't be preserving, maintaining muscle mass or anything. As you go through life and have stressful things happening and you want to take advantage of cold water and the impact that it has on, this alertness and also mood and things like depression and anxiety. That area of research is really interesting. So there's this really cool study I talked about where they had people sit in water for an hour. It was 58 degrees, and they had this group of people sit in there, and they measured these circulating catecholamines. And these catecholamines are dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And these catecholamines play a role in reward, mood, that feel-good, determination. And they measured them before they got in the cold water, and then they looked at them right after, and then for a couple hours after that time point. And they saw a 500% increase in epinephrine and a 250% increase in dopamine. That's huge. And I mean, that level of dopamine increase is similar to what you see from like these dopaminergic medications that are used for, or I should say like drugs that increase dopamine that are so addictive. And it's like you hear people like say they're addicted to this cold water. Yeah. I don't buy that because of what I talked about at the beginning, where the path to least resistance, we will get addicted to things that are not uncomfortable for us. And if you're doing cold water correctly, it's going to be uncomfortable for you. So it's hard to get yourself to do it. So whether or not you can be addicted to that, we don't know that. I don't think so, just because, again, it's difficult to initiate. Seems like it is on Reddit. Well, but yeah, I mean, you do have this crazy post response of the dopamine and that feel good and that grit, that drive, that determination that is there. It's hard to study that, but this increase in these catecholamines that play a role in that point to, okay, there's a role here. And they found that these levels did drop after they got out of the water, but they were still higher than baseline after a couple hours there. And so they remained elevated. And there's another study. This was a survey analysis of depression symptoms. This was done in 2020, and they randomized people into. This was actually with CRYO, oddly enough, and they had people do 10 CRYO sessions over the span of 2 weeks. So it was 5 CRYO sessions 1 week, and then 5 the next week, and then the other group was just a control. They had them actually stand in the cryo chamber, but they didn't drop the temperature. They still dropped the temperature, but it wasn't to induce the cold water or the cryo stimulus. And so they had the 2 groups, and then they looked at assessing depression symptoms. There's a group of surveys that are validated to actually assess somebody's level of depression. You see these used in clinical settings. They're accurate to determine if somebody does have depression, and especially accurate to assess symptoms of depression. But they're subjective, meaning that the participant's just kind of feeling out how they feel at that day. So take it with as much salt as you want. But they did show that the cryo improved symptoms of depression. So there's this impact of cold, again, probably on these catecholamines, improving mood, improving symptoms of depression there. That area of research is really cool. And so when I push people away from using cold, if you're relying on it for the mood aspects, and you're not losing
it really
the muscles
just depends
ability.
on what your goals are.
Yeah.
It does. And because you're not losing the ability to grow muscle, you're not losing the ability to gain strength. You're just decreasing that. You're attenuating it. It's harder to grow muscle, harder to grow strength. And so it does still obviously serve a purpose. And yeah, that's just a fascinating area of research.
So I was listening to Gary Brecka's podcast, and he was talking about brown fat. Can you go into it? He's saying like you use these cold tubs and you'll lose brown fat. I don't know a whole lot about brown fat. Can you kind of dive into that?
Yeah, this is that stupid swimming study from Denmark. I shouldn't say stupid. This is a great study. I'm really I do love the outcomes that were found. I just hate it when people misrepresent what was actually found. I mean, and before I get into that, I mean, Gary Brecka has just like this classic way of talking about things that he knows people are going to really tune into. One of them being like weight loss, and this cold water immersion is the best tool for weight loss. That is just crazy. Now,
Dr. Luke loves Gary Brecka.
Yeah, well, because I saw him talking about cold water. He starts talking about these like heat shock proteins. I'm like, Gary, you have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe you're talking about sauna here. But anyway, we'll save that for another time. Sorry, not sorry, Gary. But so the brown adipose tissue, this is a common area of debate with cold water, and people trying to use cold water as this like weight loss tool. And it's like, why are people trying to come up with these just like tactics of weight loss? Like, get out there and move. Go do some freaking exercise. Stop trying to figure out this 2-minute solution to your life's issues, not saying that like weight loss is your life's issue. Fat loss improves health, but like people are always looking at ways to lose weight and trying to make it as simple as they can. But in brown adipose tissue, and cold water tends to be that little target there that people go after. Now, brown adipose tissue, your body has different types of fat. It's got white fat and beige fat or brown fat, and adipose tissue is fat. And brown adipose tissue, the reason it has a beige brown color to it versus white fat is it has a lot of mitochondria. And inside of these cells, there's this thing called myoglobin. It's the ability to bind oxygen and utilize it in the mitochondria. It's why you see like red meat versus white meat. It's relative to this myoglobin and mitochondria content. And mitochondria are throw back to biology, the powerhouse of the cell, right? So mitochondria produce a ton of energy. They also have this ability to induce non-shivering thermogenesis. So thermoregulation, regulating your body temperature without shivering. And the way they do that is actually really cool. There's 2 layers. Without getting too much into the weeds, I'm going to get in the weeds, guys. Yeah. I'm sorry. So there's a couple layers of the mitochondria or membranes. There's the outer and the inner membrane. And the mitochondria is able to keep these different concentration levels from the inside membrane to the outside membrane. And everything in nature follows this concentration gradient. Things want to go from high to low concentration, high to low pressures. That's why, you know, things like wind, you know, moving from high to low pressure. When you, again, sorry, bringing you down all this crazy process. But anyway, the mitochondria can keep the high or different concentrations on different parts of the membrane. And that allows the mitochondria to produce energy, because when it opens up a door on that membrane, stuff goes funneling through from the outer to the inner membrane. And that process there allows the mitochondria to produce energy. It's like a wind turbine, or like one of those, what are the things in the water? Why am I blanking on it? That produce energy by moving, like a turbine. You know, you see them at like dams. Dams have this underneath the dams. That's why there's a dam. It's higher pressure to low pressure. Yeah, like I'm not a physics guy. Yeah, but essentially, I mean, that's what it is.
Now it's killing me.
I don't know. All the physics people, please comment in here and explain it. But essentially, like, it's this same process happening in the mitochondria, high to low pressure. It's like this production of energy, and energy is the production of heat. And so when we're cold, there's this protein called an uncoupling protein. It's able to kind of open up that membrane and just allow these concentrating gradients or concentration gradients to do their thing and generate heat and raise body temperature. So if you have more mitochondria, you have a better capacity to increase body temperature, and brown adipose tissue is involved with regulating body temperature. Now, then everyone's like, oh, well, if you can increase brown adipose tissue, you're increasing energy production, you're increasing metabolic rate, therefore you're going to lose weight and you don't have to exercise anymore. And that's where this area of debate comes in, because there's this study with a group of people who, they term them winter swimmers. They go and swim in the water in Denmark that is freezing cold, and then they were assessing, so this population that does this habitually versus a group that does not do winter swimming, and looking at what does cold exposure and sauna do to, you know, the energy expenditure, brown adipose tissue, and they looked at other metabolic metrics that we won't spend time talking about because it's not essentially as relevant here. But they did find that the winter swimmers had an increase in brown adipose tissue activation and an increase in metabolic or energy expenditure relative to the controls. But the problem is they're swimming in the winter. Yeah, no, this is active, so exercise is a great way to increase brown adipose tissue activation, increase energy expenditure. So, and also sauna does this too. There's research showing just sauna alone increases brown adipose tissue. And now you've got 3 different things that we know increase brown adipose tissue, and you're studying a population, and then all of a sudden, and that's not what the researchers were telling us in this paper. They were saying using sauna and cold water in winter swimmers improves brown adipose tissue. That's what they found. But then everyone's like, cold water. It was the cold water. It was only the cold water. Nothing matters with the sauna. Nothing matters with the exercise. Cold water is going to help you lose weight. It's like they're just trying to figure out how they could prove this point. Now,
it seems as though, because cold water is big right now, they're like, you know what? Let's just take that. Like you would say, cherry pick the data.
Yeah, well, and even if that was true, whether or not that has an impact on total daily energy expenditure to the point where it's going to do anything for weight loss, that is totally not evident. As adults, and especially as we age, we start to lose brown adipose tissue. A child is really well able to thermoregulate. They have a lot of brown adipose tissue. But as we age, that declines, and it makes up such a small portion of adipose tissue and contributes to such a small level of our total daily energy expenditure that even if you had this increase, you likely wouldn't change weight loss. It would not move the needle. There's a paper showing that increase in brown adipose tissue in individuals that were mid to late 30s only had a 20 calorie per day influence on energy expenditure. That's doing nothing. This paper here, though, they found like a range of like 500 to 1,000 calories per day. That's incredible. But again, they're exercising, they're getting in the sauna, they're getting in the cold. Like, stop telling me it's the cold, Gary. And like, I don't know. What's actually really funny about this topic is, so in one of his videos, he says something like, this is the best weight loss tool we have.
Yep.
And he even says like, and what's interesting for the women listening is blah, blah. And it's like, Gary, that's so sexist. Like, you're saying that like only women care about weight loss. Like, I don't know. This guy's crazy. But anyway, so he says that this is the number one weight loss tool here. There's actually research to suggest, well, two interesting things. One, cold increases appetite. So if you look at people who do cold water immersion or are in colder climates, they're increasing energy intake, and it's pretty subconscious. Like, they just feel hungry. They're taking in more energy. This has been studied. Cold induces an increase in energy intake. So sorry, Gary, you might actually be gaining weight in cold water. In addition to that, there's papers comparing people that exercise in cold water versus people that exercise in body temperatured water. They can have them do, you've seen these like pools where people can swim. There's different ways to test like underwater exercise, showing that cold water exercise reduced energy expenditure while you're going through this exercise protocol. So there was a reduction in energy expenditure. So if you're telling me that cold water immersion increases energy expenditure is going to lose fat, like, no, it is not. That is just
not a weight loss tool.
Okay, maybe we'll see more papers come out. And
I feel like it would do the opposite. Your body's cold. It's like, I need more fat.
Yeah, I need to
me
store
warm.
like hibernation.
Yeah. I'm going to increase fat to keep myself warm. Well, I mean, and I should point this out. There is a cool area of research on brown adipose tissue and the role it plays in metabolic health. It seems to be that people who have larger quantities of brown adipose tissue are more metabolically healthy. And you see that with people that are active throughout their life. They don't lose as much brown adipose tissue. That's a pretty cool correlation there. So I'm not saying brown adipose tissue does nothing for your health. It absolutely does. But it's just like, don't call this a weight loss tool because of brown adipose tissue. This is like classic Gary Brecka and other people on the internet that you hear just talk about like mitochondrial uncoupling and inflammation and all these big words that are like, whoa, this guy
knows his
this
stuff.
guy knows his stuff. This is stupid.
So another question I have, I was listening to the Huberman Lab, and they were talking about the effects it has on the immune system. Like, some people, I think it's either Denmark or like Norway, where they leave their kids outside of like coffee shops to build up that immune system.
That's definitely Denmark.
Yeah, well,
they love the cold stuff. But like, my kids get sick every other week. And like, should I be incorporating my kids being outside in the cold more? Or like, have you seen any research that suggests that?
You definitely can't leave your kids outside.
I mean, I'll be watching them.
The neighbors are going to call the cops. Like, no, you don't understand.
This is science.
They do it in Denmark. Like, who's my new hippie neighbor? No, so that is Denmark. And I saw that, the person who was on Andrew Huberman's lab, Dr. Soderberg, she is the one who brought that up. She's the one who did this winter swimming study.
Oh, wow,
that was her study.
Oh.
And so she came on to talk about it, and you hear her talk about it. And like, again, like, there's just, the topic of the podcast is cold exposure. So that's what Andrew Huberman is probing on.
Mm-hmm.
And so then a lot of people are listening to it thinking it's only the cold water immersion that's having these effects. But if you listen to her talk about it, she's explaining they looked at sauna, they looked at exercise, and like, going back to the study, they address a lot of differences in the control versus the intervention group. One being, there was a significantly larger amount of adipose tissue in the control participants, white adipose tissue. And if you have an increase in white adipose tissue, that can impact the detection of brown adipose tissue. So when they look at brown adipose tissue in this study, they looked at heat generation on the surface of the skin up near the chest. That happens to be where we keep most of our brown adipose tissue. And they can see if it's activated based on heat production there. If you have more adipose tissue, your temperature is going to be, if you have more white adipose tissue, that temperature is going to drop. You could still have just as much brown adipose tissue activation, but it's harder to tell with the temperature on the surface of the skin. In addition to that, you're looking at a swimming population that has increased thermoregulation from the muscle generation of heat from the muscle itself. So if you're just looking at temperature, how can you tell me it's brown adipose tissue? It could also be muscle generated heat too. And again, that's just kind of poking holes in this. And she addresses that. She admits this stuff. Now, to come back to the inflammation thing, and immune function. Now, the leaving your kids outside, no, I'd say you can bring them in.
Okay, good.
There is this inconsistent area of research. So one, the acute effects of cold are a little bit different than the chronic impacts of cold. So chronic being long-term, acute being just one bout of cold. One bout of cold water reduces certain inflammatory markers. And that's also another area that's not consistent. You see some papers show it does, some it doesn't. But more often than not, people suggest there's a reduction in inflammation. If there's a reduction in these cytokines, then there's going to be a reduction in immune cell recruitment and activation, and then you're actually decreasing your immune system activation. Wow. That's an acute effect. And so if you're, looking to increase immune function, you definitely don't want to hop in the cold. Or if you're like feeling sick, a colder environment, there's actually research on like cold, dry environments resulting in an increased susceptibility to viral and bacterial infections versus like warm, humid climates. But the interesting part of the research comes when we talk about chronic cold water immersion. There are trends to an increase in immune function with an increase in cold exposure. And I think Andrew Huberman does a good job explaining the research, but doesn't do a good job in explaining what a trend is. So when he talks about immune function in chronic cold water immersion, you'll notice him say a trend of an increase. And then he says that is not significant. Now, the way he says it, people think when I say a trend and increase, what do you take that as meaning?
It's trending upward.
Yeah, there's an increase, right? You're taking that as an increase.
Right.
Statistically, though, there is no difference. When you hear someone say a trend, it means we found no significance here, but there was a difference in terms of just the raw numbers there, but there was no statistical significance. So therefore, they cannot actually say cold water improved immune function. They can say there was a trend toward an increase in immune function. We have to do more research to see if there's any causative factor there. And so that's just a little pointer there. When you hear people say trends, that's kind of this key word of, and I do this, like when I was talking about some of the research I was doing in my PhD, like if I ever said there was an increase, but it wasn't significant, you'd get called out like, whoa. Then there wasn't an increase. You could say there was a trend, but it wasn't significant, so you cannot say there was an increase. So listen for those keywords when you're hearing people interpret data. This isn't me saying Andrew Huberman has some, initiative to try to misword things intentionally, which maybe he does. Maybe he's trying to make people think things about cold water that aren't necessarily true, but I don't think so. I think it's just the way that people who are not familiar with conducting and interpreting research and how statistical analyses work, if you don't have that level of familiarity, you're not going to know what he's saying there. But that's what a trend is. And so I don't know. I mean, maybe there's this impact of chronic. We'll see as it plays out. But right now, it doesn't seem to be that there's this clear increase in immune function. That thing in Denmark, she was saying that was just like historically done. People just, that's like one of those traditions that just happens because people are like,
maybe they just want peace and quiet.
If you rub
or something.
garlic on your nose,
Denmark
you won't get sinus infections.
Put onions in your socks.
You scare vampires. Yeah. It's just these things that get into traditions. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's not. We don't have that answer.
So basically I got from this podcast is like, if you're trying to gain muscle, stay away from this. But if you're trying to improve mood, this would be a good thing to do.
I would agree.
That's really the main points I grabbed from this.
Yeah. I mean, you did say you can still gain, but you said significantly less than
increases
just not
in
doing
muscle
cold
mass.
water.
Yeah, so like the ability to go through that protein synthesis and grow muscle was significantly attenuated, which means delayed, and then decreased in cold water versus not cold water.
Yeah, really.
That's really what it comes down
Well, it's
to.
Yeah,
good,
if that's
'cause
your
I don't want
primary
to do it
goal.
anyway.
It's what your goals
You
are.
should try it. I mean, it's actually really cool.
I've tried it. I
don't enjoy
You got to
it.
get
You know,
past that. I don't do it because I like to focus on strength and hypertrophy, mainly hypertrophy. But there was a period of time, like on and off, where I would do it, and I had an easier time doing it in the shower because I took a shower every day. I could always
more accessible.
incorporate it into
it's more accessible.
But what was interesting is when you get past that shock point. That's always kind of cool.
You know, I had something that I was thinking about a little bit ago. You ever been outside in the heat and you take a ice cold rag and put it on your neck, and the water on your neck and it drips down your spine? I get that same take your breath away feeling. Is there something to say that instead of just whole body immersion, could you just focus on the neck and spine? I don't know. That's just a thought I had.
So that gasping reflex is because of those peripheral nerves that sense temperature, that communicate it to this area in your hypothalamus. That's job is we're going to regulate our core body temperature. And so if you feel something cold, it's similar to feeling something hot. Like you get that reflex. You could have the cold you don't get that reflex unless it's like up at the diaphragm or above. You wouldn't have that with the toes. You'd pull your toe away, but the gasping reflex is not happening there. But that's what you're experiencing. Now, to answer the question of like, could you just put it on your back? In that cold water shower protocol study, they did both chest and upper back. Those were the only areas. So like that would just be your focus, is making sure it's on your upper body. I wouldn't say just doing the back. You're going to get more benefit off chest and back. And so if people are like trying to come up with a protocol, you don't have to get an ice bath. You don't need ice. You could do this in the shower. It seems to be that 3 minutes on the front, 3 minutes on the back. Have it as cold as the shower can get, because that's right around that 50 degrees. You'll work your way into it. You don't have to start at that point. Just start until you feel the breath get taken away, and then try to get to that point past that shock process where you're calming yourself down, because then you'll just be able to stay in there a lot longer. People will hop out early on because of that shock process, but you will get past that. You will get past that the first time you do it. Your body's going to calm itself down. You can't just stay in this level of shock. Your body's not going to do that. And then if you're wanting to move past the shower into a cold tub to drop the temperature, you could toss some ice in there. You can even wait for it to like heat up a little bit so it's not like right at that freezing cold level, and just start with a few minutes. I wouldn't go any longer than 10 minutes here. I mean, you're not like, a lot of these papers use 10 to 15 minutes, but in the really cold temperatures, they actually have them doing it in multiple bouts. So hopping in for 2 minutes, coming out, hopping back in for 2 minutes, coming out, and not staying in there for that long period of time. Because again, you don't want to induce hypothermia, but play around with it. And then you just want to progress to induce that stress response and pay attention to how your body's adapting. But again, if you're training for hypertrophy and strength, then use the sauna.
Do it.
Yeah.
Sauna.
Because again, the sauna has,
After your workout.
I mean, there's really no benefit that cold has that sauna doesn't. And sauna has even more benefits there, and sauna's just not as like sexy online. People aren't taking pictures of them sweating with random other people in the sauna and posting it online. It's just people want to post the cold water. Yeah, except for Joe Rogan. Yeah.
Well, any other thoughts
That was
here?
awesome. Yeah. I learned so much today. Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Thanks, Dr. Luke.
Hey, you're welcome, guys. I'm going to miss you guys.
Miss you too. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Should we go hop in the cold tub?
no.
Let's get Joe in a cold
Thanks
tub.
again
Fuck
for
that.
tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.